Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on coordinating responses. This is part of our Module 5, Part 5 series about plant and animal responses, and what we're going to be doing in this video is having a look at specification reference 5.1.5J, the coordination of responses by the nervous and endocrine systems. So the key response that they want you to know about as far as the OCR specification goes is the fight or flight response. And when we talk about the fight or flight response, then this is basically the way that a body is going to respond to some kind of a threat to its survival. So you have two options. Number one is that you can prepare to fight, or you can prepare to run away. So they're your kind of two options available for your survival. You could fight it out, or you can just run and hope that you can outrun whatever the danger may be. If we have a little look at some of the typical changes that we see in one of these mammals when they are threatened, then first thing that you're going to see is that the heart rate and blood pressure are going to increase. And the reason that those two things are going to increase are that our muscles require more oxygen and glucose to carry out respiration, because obviously we're going to see much greater levels of muscle contraction, and for that muscle contraction we require ATP. We're also going to be generating a greater number of those toxins through those processes that are happening inside those cells, and therefore we need to remove those toxins from the regions they're being produced in. Second one is that the ventilation rate and depth will increase, and the whole idea about this is to increase the amount of oxygen being taken into the blood for obviously aerobic respiration in places like our muscle cells. We also see these things called the erector pili muscles contracting, and these are basically the muscles that are attached at the base of hairs, and as a result hairs stand on end. And obviously it's not such a big thing that we find in humans. It's not particularly aggressive if the hairs on your arm stand on end, let's be honest. But in the animal kingdom, where we've got things like cats, they're a great example of this. When they decide they're going to try and look all threatening, then they puff themselves up into that giant fuzzball. So their tail becomes really puffy, the hair on their back stands on end, and obviously they attempt to look threatening, which if they're a teeny tiny kitten, is not that threatening. But, you know, big cats, probably more so. The next one is the pupils in the eye are going to dilate. And the whole idea behind that is to allow more light to enter the eye, therefore obviously stimulating greater number of action potentials travelling down that optic nerve. We're going to see an increase in blood glucose levels because we need more glucose to get to the various locations in the body for respiration to take place. And because all of these reactions are increasing, the metabolic rate is going to increase. So more of that glucose gets converted into ATP. We also see the arterioles that go to our digestive system and skin constricting, whereas any of those arterioles that supply our muscles and our liver will dilate. So basically we're reducing the flow of blood to the less essential areas, digestion, skin, and making sure that as much blood as possible gets to the muscles and the liver, the essential parts for that fight or flight. So it's all about diverting the blood to the muscles and away from the non-essential areas. We also see a release of these things called endorphins. And the kind of reason behind this endorphin release is that they act as an analgesic. So basically they mask that pain feeling that you get. So if you're imagining a fight or flight response, then if you were to be experiencing the full impact of those pain receptors firing, it could impede your ability to either fight or run. So what we find is that that endorphin release reduces the perception of pain, so you will still keep running or keep fighting that bit longer despite those injuries that you've got. Now, when it comes to coordinating all of those different bits, we're involving both hormonal and neuronal systems. So what we actually find is that that threat is going to be perceived by certain external features, so eyes, ears, nose, and then also internal threats. So if your blood pressure has a sudden drop, or if you're experiencing excruciating pain, for example, then you can see those same responses because it's an internal threat versus the external. But we clearly have to have monitoring of those two potential sources of threat, both internal and external. Once we've detected the stimulus, it gets communicated to the cerebrum by that nervous system, and the region of the brain called the amygdala is then going to send impulses to the different regions of the brain that are going to be involved in this control. So regions like the hypothalamus, for example, come into play there. And that hypothalamus is going to lead to two key changes. First one, the sympathetic nervous system will be activated, and if we think back to our previous video and we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, that's things like increasing the heart rate, increased ventilation rate, etc. Secondly, it's going to cause the release of hormones and stimulate the anterior pituitary to release hormones as well. So we're getting this release of hormones from the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary, which are then going to have their own parts to play in that fight or flight response. If we just take a moment to focus on the sympathetic nervous system first of all, the sympathetic neurons are going to transmit an impulse to the adrenal medulla. So remember, the adrenal medulla is in the adrenal gland, hence adrenal. And what happens is those sympathetic neurons then cause the release of adrenaline into the bloodstream. The adrenaline is then going to travel through the blood, obviously, to those target cells and target organs, and bring about those physiological responses that we discussed earlier. In terms of adrenaline itself, it's a hormone, and what we're going to find is we've got a great example of cell signaling here, because we are producing a hormone that's then going to affect many different types of cells. And if we think back to some of the earlier work in Module 5, we talked about these first and second messengers. So adrenaline is a first messenger. So it causes an effect in its target cell without entering the cell itself. So it won't enter the cell, but it does cause an effect. In terms of what happens, the adrenaline binds to that receptor on the plasma membrane, and then that receptor is associated with a G protein, which acts kind of like a switch in the cell. So that G protein is then going to cause the stimulation of the enzyme adenyl cyclase. So what we're really seeing, adrenaline binds to its receptor, that then causes the G protein to act as a switch, which then activates the enzyme adenyl cyclase. And the adenyl cyclase is an enzyme that converts ATP into CAMP, cyclic AMP, and it's that cyclic AMP that is the second messenger. So that will activate enzymes inside the cell itself. So the typical effects of adrenaline then: increased heart rate, the enzymes in the liver get stimulated to convert the glycogen stores into glucose, which can obviously be used in respiration. We get decreased blood flow to the digestive system through that process of vasoconstriction, increased blood pressure because of that vasoconstriction that's occurring, and then we're going to get increased blood flow to the muscles in the brain through vasodilation. So remember, we've got different areas that are going to dilate to constrict. We also see the bronchioles increase in their width, obviously allowing a greater degree of gas to pass into the lungs, and your pupils dilate, as already mentioned. It is worth remembering that when we talk about the hormonal action, it's not just adrenaline. That hypothalamus is also going to release certain hormones called releasing factors that pass down that portal vessel to the pituitary gland. And as a result of those hormones passing down to the pituitary gland, we then see the release of these tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary. One example of these hormones is CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. So that's released from the hypothalamus, and it causes the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the ACTH is then going to travel in the blood, and it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release corticoid hormones. And we've kind of got that in the name if you learn the full name of it, which you don't have to. Go with abbreviations where we can. So CRH, released from the hypothalamus, causes the release of the ACTH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release the corticoid hormones. And the example we looked at in a previous video is cortisol. And if you remember, cortisol is all to do with regulating carbohydrate metabolism. So what we're going to see with those increased levels of cortisol, then we're going to get more glucose being released from the glycogen. Second hormone to be aware of here is TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, which causes the release of TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which you may have heard about back at GCSE. Now, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, surprisingly, stimulates the thyroid gland. And what it's going to stimulate that thyroid gland to do is to release thyroxine. And thyroxine is all to do with increasing that metabolic rate inside the cells. So what we've got, the cortisol and the thyroxine basically working together to allow this increased metabolic rate inside cells, which all contributes to allowing that fight or flight response. As always, I hope you found the video useful today, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can see when more videos are uploaded, and of course head on over to the website to access a range of different resources to assist you in your A-level biology studies.